"I'm so cold, Sarah." Those were the last words my sister, Emily, whispered to me. She was coughing her lungs out, and I ran to beg my mother. She didn't even look at her. She just glanced at my father, who was sitting silently in the dark corner, then turned to me and shook her head. "It's useless to burn more wood," she said, her voice void of emotion. "She's a lost cause." And in that moment, I understood a horrific truth. It wasn't the illness. Our own parents had decided to let Emily die. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because some truths need to be spread, even if they shake your beliefs. Some stories, no matter how painful, must be told. I was born in a simple little house on the outskirts of my town in New Jersey, right where the town starts to turn into farmland. It was a wooden house with a porch that creaked when the wind blew hard, a roof that leaked on stormy nights, but which still seemed cozy to a child's eyes. We were a family of 4, me, my sister Emily, my mother Dorothy, and my father Frank. Ah, my little sister Emily. She was 3 years younger than me, a fragile-looking girl, like a little bird fallen from the nest. Her hair was so light, it looked almost white in the sun, and she had a sweet smile that lit up any dark corner of the house. From the time she was tiny, Emily had delicate health. She caught colds easily. She had that cough that would come and refuse to leave during the harsh winters. I remember seeing her wrapped in blankets, even on days that weren't that cold. My mother, Dorothy, was a quiet woman, of few words and even fewer smiles. She spent her days taking care of the house, washing clothes in the utility sink in the mudroom, cooking what we had, which wasn't much. When I think of her now, I always remember her rough hands from so much work, her stooped posture as if she were carrying an invisible weight on her back, and her eyes that always seemed distant, looking at a place no one else could see. And my father, Frank Johnson, was a foreman on a large produce farm in the region, a tall man with broad shoulders and heavy hands. He always came home smelling of diesel and cheap whiskey, bringing with him a silence that made the whole house hold its breath. When he walked in, it was as if the air became thinner, harder to breathe. He didn't talk much. He preferred gestures to words, and his gestures weren't always kind, especially with my mother and with little Emily. Our routine started early with the rooster's crow. Emily and I shared a straw mattress in a small room at the back of the house. We'd wake up to our mother calling softly, "Girls, it's time." Before the sun was up, we were already helping with the chores, bringing water from the well, feeding the chickens, sweeping the yard. Then I would go to the town school, a walk of almost an hour on dirt roads. Emily rarely went. "She's not healthy enough for that," my father would say, although I knew it was more because he thought educating girls was a waste of time. At school, I was one of those who most enjoyed learning. Mrs. Anderson said I had a good head for letters. I dreamed of being a teacher someday, having my own classroom, teaching children to read and write. But I kept that dream very quiet in my heart, because at home there was no space for dreams like that. When I came back from school, I spent the rest of the day helping my mother and taking care of Emily. We played when there was time, making up stories with rag dolls my grandmother had made, or running around the yard chasing the butterflies that visited our flowers. Emily had a special way of seeing beauty in the simplest things. A colorful stone, a leaf with a different shape, the way the light came through the cracks in the window at dusk. "Look, Sarah, it looks like melted gold," she would tell me. And I could see it too through her eyes. Weekends were the hardest days. My father stayed home, and the tension grew like a storm cloud. He demanded absolute silence for his rest, and any little noise, the scuff of a slipper on the linoleum floor, one of Emily's coughs, the clinking of a dish could awaken his fury. "There's no control in this house," he would shout. And then came the punishment, usually for my mother, for not controlling the girls as she should. There were good days, too. I don't want you to think it was all sadness. At the County Harvest Festival, when the community gathered to give thanks for the crops, there was music, food, and dancing. My father would soften up on those days. Maybe out of respect for the neighbors, maybe because of the beer that flowed freely. In those rare moments, he would even pick Emily up in his arms, calling her my little princess. And I almost believed he could be a father like the others. It was around the time I turned 9 that I began to notice the worst in my father. It wasn't just his difficult temper or his heavy hands when he was angry. It was his gaze toward Emily, a look of contempt mixed with rage, as if her very existence deeply offended him. "Scrawny kid, nothing but an expense," he would mutter when he thought no one was listening. You might ask, how could a father be so cruel? I've asked myself that my entire life, and this is what I've learned. When a man feels like a failure, empty inside, he will try to put out the light in anyone around him. Emily's weakness, my dears, was just an excuse for his own cruelty. Emily was 6 at the time, and her health seemed to worsen with each passing winter. She would cough until she was breathless. She had fevers that came and went. Dr. Miller, the town doctor, who would stop by as a favor when things got really bad, said once that she needed expensive medicine, better food, warmth, and special care. "I'm not going to spend what I don't have on a weakness God sent," was my father's response. "If she's meant to go, she'll go. I'm not going to break my back working to support someone who's never going to be good for anything." That's when my father's special treatments to toughen Emily up began. When she coughed too much at night and wouldn't let anyone sleep, he would take her to the tool shed, a cold, damp place at the back of the property. "You're going to learn to control that cough," he'd say. In the morning, we'd find Emily huddled in a corner, shivering from the cold, her lips purple, but not making a sound. It's a terrible thing to realize your protector is actually the monster. This cruelty was aimed at Emily, but it was a lesson in pure terror for Sarah. The cold in that shed was just the beginning of the darkness in that house. When she couldn't eat everything on her plate, and it was truly difficult, as my sister had little appetite, she went without the next meal. "Anyone who doesn't value what's on the table doesn't deserve more," was what he'd say. My mother witnessed everything with that distant look I mentioned. Sometimes, in secret, she would bring Emily a piece of bread or some fruit. Other times, she would simply turn her face away and continue her chores as if nothing was happening. Small and powerless, I didn't understand why she didn't do more to protect my sister. Only many years later did I understand that she herself was broken inside, incapable of protecting even herself. And so went the years of my childhood in New Jersey, divided between the school that gave me hope and the house that taught me fear. I grew strong, despite everything. Emily seemed to wither, like a small flower without enough water. With each passing year, the sparkle in her eyes dimmed a little. The smile appeared less frequently. Her voice became quieter. When I was 12, and Emily was 9, there was a particularly harsh winter. The frosts were so severe that they left everything white until almost noon. The wind cut like a razor, and our little wooden house seemed like paper against it. It was during that winter that I first felt the real fear of losing my sister, as things at home began to get even worse. The harvest that year had been bad because of the early frosts, and my father had lost part of his job at the farm. He still worked there some days of the week, but the money just wasn't the same. And when the money decreased, his mood plummeted right along with it. I remember the day I got home from school and found our little house quieter than usual. You couldn't hear the sound of my mother moving pots, nor the quiet humming of Emily, who even when sick, liked to murmur those old songs our grandmother taught us. A heavy silence, the kind that seems to foreshadow misfortune. I found Emily huddled under our bed, trembling I don't know if from cold or fear. When she saw me, she put her little finger to her lips, asking for silence. "What's wrong, Emily?" I whispered, crouching down to see her better. "Dad came home early," she replied, so quietly I could barely hear. "He says I'm going to have to work to help out at home." My heart sank. Emily could barely stay on her feet for long without a coughing fit knocking her down. What kind of work did my father imagine she could do? The answer came the next morning, when he dragged Emily out of bed before the sun even came up. "From now on, you're going to the farm with me. There's plenty of work there that even a useless girl like you can do." "But Dad," I tried to intervene. "Emily's not strong enough for that. She can barely." I didn't finish the sentence. One look from him was enough to silence me. That look that said everything without needing words. "Stay out of it, or it'll be worse for you." And so, from that day on, Emily began to go with my father to the farm, where she worked in the packing house, peeling potatoes, washing bins, carrying buckets of water. She would return at the end of the day exhausted, her hands red and raw, her breathing more difficult than ever. "How was it today, Emily?" I'd ask her while helping her into bed. "I'm helping the family, Sarah," was what she'd answer, with a weak smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Dad says I'm good for something now." At night, I'd hear her cough getting worse, that dry, hacking sound that seemed to rip through her chest. I'd get up to wet a cloth with water and put it on her forehead when the fever spiked. I begged my mother to call the doctor, but she just shook her head. "Your father says we don't have money for a doctor. Besides, it's just a bad cold. It'll pass." But it wasn't just a cold, and it didn't pass. In the following weeks, I watched my little sister fade away like a plant without sun or water. Her skin, which was already pale, became almost transparent. You could see the bluish veins in her temples. Her eyes, sinking deeper, lost that sparkle that made everything seem magical. The cough worsened, and sometimes it came with a red stain on the handkerchief she used to cover her mouth. On one particularly cold night, when my father wasn't home, I gathered my courage and confronted my mother. "Emily is dying. Mom, can't you see it? We have to do something." My mother stopped what she was doing. She stood motionless for what seemed like an eternity. Then, without turning to me, she said in a voice I had never heard before, a voice heavy with an ancient sadness, "Some people are just born to suffer in this life, Sarah. We can't do anything against God's will. Or your father's." Those words landed like stones in my childhood heart. She truly believed that, my dears. She believed her fate was to suffer. When someone believes there is no way out, they stop looking for the door. And I realized that was my mother's greatest tragedy, even more so than my father's fists. How could a mother talk like that about her own daughter? How could she accept all of that without doing anything? It was the first time I felt rage toward my mother, a rage mixed with a profound disappointment that never left me. By the time Emily was 12, she could barely go to the farm anymore. My father, instead of letting her rest, found a new way to make her useful. He started taking her to the houses of wealthy families in Princeton, where she worked as a maid, washing, ironing, cooking chores far too heavy for her fragile body. Dr. Miller said her lungs are weak. "Dad," I tried to explain one time. He said she needs rest. "What she needs is to stop being a burden on this family," he retorted, slamming the table so hard the dishes jumped. "If she can't help, she might as well not be here." And in those houses where she went to work, Emily faced new kinds of cruelty. It wasn't just the heavy chores. It was the way they treated her. The sick girl, they called her, or the poor thing. But they didn't stop her from carrying heavy buckets or scrubbing the floor on her knees. Some mistresses were kinder. They'd give her leftover food to bring home or an old sweater their children had outgrown. But others, "I didn't get to eat today. Mrs. Sinclair left me without food," Emily told me once, her eyes full of tears. She said I broke an expensive plate and that the cost would come out of my meal. I burned with rage, but what could I do? I was just a 5-year-old girl, with no power at all in that world, which seemed to spin only according to the will of adults, especially the men. It was around that time that I met Caleb, the son from the general store where we bought on a tab when money was tight. A boy with kind eyes, a few years older than me, who always set aside a pack of cookies or a piece of fruit when he saw me coming. "It's for your little sister," he'd say, slipping the package into my bag without his father seeing. My mother had weak lungs, too. I know how it is. Caleb was the first person to show me that not everyone was cruel, that there were hands that reached out to help, not to hurt. When I told him how things were at home, he would listen attentively, without judging, without giving impossible advice. He just listened, and sometimes that was all I needed someone to truly hear. In the winter, Emily turned 15. She barely left her bed. The cough had transformed into something horrible, coming in fits so strong they left her gasping for air, her face red, her eyes wide with terror. The effort to breathe was so great that you could see her ribs moving under her nearly transparent skin. "Dad, please," I begged one night, kneeling before him. Emily needs to go to the hospital in Camden. She's dying. For the first time, I saw something in his eyes that could be mistaken for concern. It wasn't love, I'm sure of that, but perhaps it was fear of others' opinions, of being judged for what was happening under his own roof. "We'll wait until the weekend," he finally said. "If she's not better, I'll take her." But the weekend was too far away. 3 days after that conversation, I woke up to the sound of Emily's cough. It was weak, desperate, and shallow. The moonlight cut across our small mattress, and I saw her shivering, her eyes wide with a terror I recognized. "I'm so cold, Sarah," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Those were the last words she ever spoke to me. She was coughing her lungs out, a terrible, wet sound. I ran from the room, stumbling into the kitchen where the last embers glowed in the stove. "Mom, please," I screamed. "She's freezing. We need more wood." My mother was sitting at the dark kitchen table, a silhouette. She didn't even look at me. She just glanced toward the dark corner where my father sat, silent and watching. Then, she turned her head back to the dying fire. "It's useless to burn more wood," she said, her voice void of all emotion. "She's a lost cause." My father grunted in agreement. "Let her be. It's time to stop wasting resources." And in that moment, I understood the horrific truth. It wasn't the illness. Our own parents had decided to let Emily die. Did you hear that? Useless. A waste of resources. When a mother can say those words, when the warmth of firewood is more precious than her own child's life, well, then you know the real cold wasn't outside. It was right there, in their hearts. I ran back to the room, but my father blocked the doorway. "Stop bothering us," he snarled, and shut the door, leaving me in the kitchen. I spent the rest of the night huddled against that door, listening to my sister's breathing grow quieter, and then stop. I held my own hands over my mouth, suffocating the screams, knowing I was utterly alone. This is the absolute breaking point. It wasn't the illness that took Emily. It was a choice made by her parents. Sarah is now trapped in that house, alone, with the very people responsible for her sister's death. I sang our grandmother's songs, stroked her hair, told her I loved her more than anything in the world. I don't know if she heard me, but I want to believe she did, that in her final moments, she felt that there was at least one person in this world to whom she truly mattered. When the sun came up, Emily was no longer with us. Her small, fragile body had finally found the rest that life never allowed her. The day that followed Emily's death was a blur of disconnected images and sounds in my memory. I remember the strong smell of coffee in the kitchen, mixed with the sweet, strange scent coming from our room where my sister's body lay waiting. I remember my father's voice, harsh as always, giving orders. "Go call Mr. Harrison at the funeral home. Tell him it's a simple affair, that we don't have money to waste." I moved like a ghost through the house, as if my body was there, but I myself had left with my sister. My mother cleaned the house furiously, as if she wanted to erase any trace of Emily. At one point, I saw her gathering my sister's few clothes into a bundle. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm giving all this away. It's no use here anymore," she replied without looking at me. "But Mom, it's all that's left of her." "It's better not to keep things from the dead, Sarah. It brings bad luck." It was the first time I felt that I hadn't just lost my sister, but also any chance of preserving her memory in that house. It was as if everyone wanted to pretend Emily had never existed. The wake was simple, held in our own room. Emily, dressed in the only good dress, she had a light blue one, faded from so many washings, looked like she was just sleeping. Her face, for the first time in a long time, showed no signs of suffering or fear. A few neighbors came, brought coffee and casseroles, prayed the rosary with us. The pastor appeared briefly, gave a short blessing. "An angel of the Lord," he called Emily, and that gave me some comfort. At least someone saw my sister for what she truly was. An angel who passed through this earth only briefly, without ever truly knowing what human warmth was. Few bothered to go to the cemetery the next day. Besides our family, only Caleb, who stayed by my side the whole time, holding my hand when I thought I was going to fall apart, and 2 or 3 of the closest neighbors. It was a cloudy day, with a fine mist that left everything with a sad sheen, as if the sky itself was weeping for what my mother could not. It was there, in front of that open grave, as Emily's simple casket was lowered into the earth, that it happened. We were standing in silence, my father, my mother, and I when I felt a movement beside me. My father leaned in, getting so close I could smell his sour breath of morning whiskey. Then, in a whisper that only I could hear, he said the words that chilled my blood. "Now there's only you left." It wasn't just what he said, but the way he said it. There was something in his voice, a sinister promise, a poorly disguised threat that made me understand in an instant that Emily's fate could very well be mine. That now, without my sister to absorb part of his rage, it would all be turned on me. In a panic, I looked for my mother's gaze. Ever since I was little, even knowing she did little to protect us, I still looked to her for some sign that there was an ally there, someone who would understand my fear. Our eyes met for a second, and then something happened that broke the last thread of hope I still held. She laughed a short, choked, cynical laugh and added, "At least this one is stronger. She'll take longer to break." A mother, laughing at her own child's terror. It makes no sense, I know. I didn't understand it for many, many years, but I see it now. That wasn't a laugh. That was the sound of a soul that had died long ago. A soul that was jealous of anyone still trying to live. In that moment, there in front of my sister's grave, I understood that I was alone, completely alone, between two people who saw my suffering not as something to be avoided, but as something inevitable, or worse, something that gave them some perverse kind of satisfaction. The walk home was the longest of my life. Every step took me back to the place that I now knew for certain was no longer a home, but a prison where I would be the next victim. Caleb tried to talk to me, to ask if I would be okay, if there was anything he could do, but I could barely respond. How could I explain the horror I had just understood? How could I tell someone that your own parents are eagerly awaiting your suffering? The days that followed confirmed my fears. With Emily out of the way, my father concentrated all the cruelty he used to divide between us onto me. The difference was that it was no longer my supposed physical weakness that irritated him. It was my strength, my resilience, which seemed to be a challenge to him. "Those letters of yours aren't going to do you any good," he'd say, tearing up my school books. "What you need is to learn to be a real woman." Being a woman, in my father's view, meant serving without question, accepting any treatment without complaint, bending to the will of men, first to his, then to a future husband's, whom he made it clear he was already planning to find for me. Mr. Peterson's son, the one who owns the hardware store on the town square, is looking for a wife. "I already told him you're available," he announced one day during dinner. "He's no young buck, but he has money. He'll get you off my back, Mr. Peterson did have a son, Chester, already close to 40, known in town for his violent temper and for mistreating stray animals. The thought of being handed over to him gave me nightmares for weeks. It was around that time that my mother began to change too. Not for the better, for the worse. If before she was distant, now she seemed to have developed an active hostility toward me. She criticized everything I did. She said I was stuck up, that I thought I was better than everyone just because I could read and write well. "Your sister, at least she knew her place," she said once while I was washing the dishes. "You have that look in your eye that irritates me. It's like you're always judging me." And she was right. I was judging her, yes. I judged her cowardice, her complicity in my father's cruelty, her failure to be the mother that both I and Emily needed. The difference was, unlike Emily, I didn't hide that judgment. It was there in my eyes, in my posture, in my refusal to break completely. Little by little, my life turned into a daily hell. I woke up before dawn to do all the house chores. I went to the farm to replace the work that used to be Emily's. I came back to finish the domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, washing. There was no more time for school. My father forbade it, saying I had already learned too many letters. At night, locked in the little room I once shared with my sister, I felt Emily's ghost beside me. It wasn't fear, it was comfort. Sometimes I would talk to her in whispers, telling her about my day, my worries, my impossible plans to escape. I'm going to get out of here one day, Emily. I'd promise in the dark. I'm going to find a way. But what way? I had no money, nowhere to go, no one who could truly help me. Caleb, as kind as he was just a boy under his own father's authority. And in small rural towns, in those days, a father's word was law. No one interfered in family matters, even if those matters involved abuse and cruelty. As the months went by, I felt my spirit, once so strong, starting to give way. It was as if a light inside me was dimming, growing weaker every day. I began to wonder if my mother was right. Maybe it was easier to accept, to bend, to stop fighting. Maybe the fate of women like us really was just that, to serve, suffer, and eventually disappear without a trace. On one particularly terrible night, when my father came home drunk and furious after losing money gambling, he broke almost everything in the kitchen, beat my mother until she passed out, and then came after me. I managed to lock myself in the small room, pushing the dresser against the door, while he pounded on the wood from the outside. "You're not going to escape forever," he yelled. "Sooner or later, I'm going to teach you some respect." Huddled in the corner of the room, praying the door would hold, I made a decision. If I stayed there, I would end up like Emily, or worse, like my mother, a shadow of a person, empty inside. I had to find a way out, any way at all. The next morning, as I was cleaning up the shards of glass and the dried blood from the kitchen floor, a knock on the front door startled me. We weren't expecting anyone, and visitors were not common at our house. The townspeople, even without knowing exactly what happened in there, sensed that something was wrong and kept their distance. I opened the door fearfully and found myself face to face with an elderly gentleman I had never seen before. He had white hair, a face wrinkled by time and sun, and eyes of such a light blue they seemed almost transparent. Eyes that, I noticed with a jolt, looked very much like Emily's. "Good morning, child," he said in a voice that was gruff but kind. "Is this the house of Frank Johnson?" "Yes, this is it," I replied to the white-haired man, still holding the door halfway open, fearful. "My father isn't here. He left for work at the farm." "And your mother?" he asked, looking over my shoulder into the house. "Is she resting?" "She wasn't feeling well during the night," I replied, not going into detail about what had really happened. The man nodded, a look of understanding crossing his wrinkled face. "I see. My name is Walter Hughes. I'm your maternal grandfather's brother. God rest his soul. I heard about your sister's passing. Late, unfortunately." I stood frozen for a moment. A great uncle. I had never heard of him. My mother rarely mentioned her family, and when she did, it was always vaguely, as if they were people from a past too distant to matter. "May I come in, daughter? I'd like to pay my respects," he continued, gentle but firm. There was a natural authority in his voice that made me open the door without questioning. Great-Uncle Walter entered our simple house with a dignity that seemed out of place in that atmosphere of misery and desperation. He carried a small, worn leather satchel and a hat, which he held respectfully in his hands. He sat in the chair I offered him, observing the room with sharp eyes that seemed to take in every detail. The broken dishes I hadn't finished cleaning up, the stains on the floor that my hasty cleaning hadn't managed to completely hide, the heavy air of a house where happiness hadn't existed for a long time. "I've come from Lancaster," he explained. "I only just found out about the girl's passing." "What was her name?" "Emily," I replied, feeling the familiar pain tighten in my chest. "My sister Emily." "Emily?" he repeated respectfully. "I only learned of her passing when I ran into an acquaintance from New Jersey by chance. I came as soon as I could, but the roads are difficult with all this rain. Just then, I heard a noise coming from my parents' room. My mother had woken up. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, her face swollen, a dark bruise forming near her left eye. "Uncle Walter?" she said, her voice choked with surprise. "What are you doing here?" "Dorothy." He stood up, but didn't approach her. There was a deep sadness in his eyes. "I arrived too late for your girl's funeral. I'm sorry. I saw something strange happen to my mother's face. For a brief instant, a genuine emotion, perhaps shame, perhaps remorse, seemed to cross her normally blank features, but it lasted only a second. It was soon replaced by the familiar mask of indifference. "You shouldn't have bothered," she said coldly. "It was just pneumonia. These things happen." Great-uncle Walter didn't reply immediately. His eyes, so much like Emily's, fixed on my mother's bruised face. Then they moved to me, noticing the finger marks on my arms, which I tried to hide by pulling down the sleeves of my dress. "I'm going to stay in town for a few days," he finally announced. "If it's no trouble, I'd like to visit again. It's been a long time since I've seen my grandniece." My mother looked uncomfortable, but she had no way to refuse without seeming rude. "As you wish, Uncle, but our house is simple. We don't have much to offer. I don't need luxury, Dorothy, just a bit of family company." When he left, promising to return the next day, I felt a strange mix of hope and fear. There was something about that man, a dignity, a quiet strength, that made me feel he wasn't like the other people in town, who pretended not to see what was happening in our house. But I also knew his presence could infuriate my father, and that never ended well for anyone. My fears were confirmed that night. When we told my clues, the father, about Great-uncle Walter's visit, he exploded. "Nosy old man. What's he coming here for? To stick his nose where it doesn't belong. None of that Hughes family is worth anything. They're all the same, full of grand airs, but not a dime to their name." My mother, as always, lowered her head and said nothing. I, however, couldn't contain myself. "He just came to pay his respects for Emily. He's family." That was a mistake. My father turned on me like an enraged bull. "Family? The only family you have is me, and I'm sick of this attitude of yours. Do you think I didn't see how you looked at me at that useless sister's funeral? As if it was my fault she was too weak to live." "Emily wasn't weak," I shouted, completely losing my sense of danger. Something inside me had broken, maybe the last thread of fear that still controlled me. "She died because you mistreated her whole life, because you sent her to work sick, because you let her go hungry as punishment, because you locked her in the shed in winter." The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. My father looked at me with a hatred so pure it almost seemed to transform him into another person. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and trembling with contained rage. "Tomorrow morning, I'm going to talk to Mr. Peterson's son. You're going to marry him next week, even if I have to tie you up. And if you open that mouth one more time, it'll be to eat your own teeth. This is no longer just about cruelty, it's a transaction. Her father is about to sell her to a man just like him, and he makes it clear she has no choice. Sarah is completely cornered, and her window for escape is closing fast." That was the moment I realized. Fear can kill you faster than any illness. But you know, sometimes being backed into a corner by that fear is the very thing that lights the strongest fire. They wanted to bury me, but they didn't know I was a seed. I would not let them. That night, I locked myself in the room as usual, pushing the dresser against the door. But this time I knew it wasn't enough. The threat of a forced marriage to Chester wasn't a bluff. My father would do it, and I would be handed over to a man as cruel as him, or worse. Sitting on the bed I once shared with Emily, I cried as I hadn't cried since the day of the funeral. They weren't just tears of fear or sadness, they were tears of a rage I had never allowed myself to fully feel. Rage for what they did to my sister, for what they were trying to do to me, for all the years of silence and terror. "I'm not going to let this happen, Emily," I whispered to my sister's ghost, who seemed more present than ever. "I'm not going to end up like you or like Mom. I'd rather die trying to escape." The next day, my father left early, determined to speak with Mr. Peterson and his son. My mother, still marked by the previous night's beating, avoided looking at me. She was cleaning the house frantically, as she always did when she was nervous. "Why did you never run away?" I asked her suddenly as I swept the living room floor. She stopped what she was doing, frozen for a moment, as if the question were a slap. "Run away where, Sarah?" she finally replied, her voice empty of emotion. "To go back to my father's house, which was just as bad or worse. To live on charity from others? You prefer to live like this? Being beaten, watching your daughters suffer? You don't understand," she said, and for an instant, I saw a flash of the young woman she must have been before life broke her. Some people are born to suffer. I'm one of them. Your sister was another. I had hoped you'd be different. But you see, in the end, we all fall into the same pit. Those words, instead of discouraging me, ignited an even greater determination within me. I would not be like my mother. I would not accept that fate as inevitable. It was around noon when Great-Uncle Walter appeared again, as he had promised. This time, with my father not at home, I invited him in and asked him to sit. I offered him what little we had, some weak coffee and some cornbread I had made that morning. The old man sat, observing the interaction between my mother and me. I don't know exactly what he saw, but his clear eyes seemed to see beyond appearances, beyond the unspoken words, straight to the rotten heart of that house. "Dorothy," he said suddenly, his voice soft but firm, "do you remember when you were a girl, before you married this man?" My mother, who had her back to him, arranging something on the shelf, froze. Her shoulders tensed. "Yes, I remember," she answered without turning. "I saw that same look on your face when you were a girl," the great-uncle continued, now looking at me. "That same fear, that same resignation starting to take hold. I did nothing back then. I didn't realize what was happening until it was too late, until you were already trapped in this marriage." He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I'm not going to make the same mistake twice," he concluded. The rest of that day passed in a strange calm, like the silence that precedes a great storm. My mother avoided looking directly at Great-Uncle Walter, as if she were afraid of what she might see reflected in his eyes. As for me, I felt a confusing mix of hope and distrust. After all, in my 18 years of life, I had learned that kindness rarely came without a price. The great-uncle stayed until almost dusk, asking seemingly casual questions about life in the house, about how I spent my days, about my plans for the future. I answered cautiously, without revealing the full horror of our situation. But something told me that he already knew, or at least suspected, the truth behind our measured words. When he finally said goodbye, he took my hands in his rough from a lifetime of work, but gentle in the way they held mine. "Sarah, you have my mother's eyes," he said, "eyes of someone who wasn't born to bend." Then, in a movement so subtle I almost didn't notice, he slipped a small, folded piece of paper into the palm of my hand. Only after he left did I manage to read the note, written in that shaky handwriting of an elderly person. "I'll be at the corner by the church at midnight. Bring only what is essential. W." I read and reread those words, hardly believing what they meant. It was an offer of escape, a hand extended at the exact moment I needed it most. But distrust, the constant companion of one who lives in fear, made me hesitate. What if it was a trap? What if my father had found out and planned all this to test me? My father's return at dusk dispelled any doubts I might have had. He entered the house triumphant, smelling of whiskey and satisfaction. "It's all arranged," he announced, throwing his hat on the table. "Sunday, you're marrying Chester." Mr. Peterson agreed to pay a good sum. "At least you're good for something, after all." My mother, kneeling by the stove, barely nodded, as if we were talking about the weather or the harvest, not my future being sold. "Dad," I tried one last time, in the calmest voice I could manage. "I don't want to marry Chester. He's old enough to be my father, and everyone knows he's cruel to people." My father looked at me, and there was a satisfied cruelty in his eyes that chilled me to the bone. "You think you have a choice? You think anyone cares what you want? You're going to marry him, and you're going to be an obedient wife, or you'll regret the day you were born." In that moment, looking at that man who should have protected me, but who had always been my greatest threat, I knew that Great-Uncle Walter's note was my only chance. It didn't matter the risk. Anything was better than the fate that awaited me as Chester's wife. During dinner, I kept my eyes down and answered only what was necessary. I wanted to seem defeated, submissive, so as not to arouse suspicion. Inside, however, my mind was working frantically, planning what to take, what clothes to wear, how to get out of the house without making noise. When everyone had gone to bed, I stayed awake, lying in the dark, counting the minutes. The clock in the living room struck 11 when I heard my father's heavy snoring coming from the next room. I waited a little longer, just to be sure. Then, I got up silently. There was little to take. A few changes of clothes, an old photo where I, Emily, and my grandmother appeared, the only good memory I kept, and the small mother-of-pearl pin that had belonged to my sister. I wrapped everything in a large scarf, the kind of bundle that wouldn't attract attention if someone saw me leaving. I was about to open the back door, my hand trembling on the knob, when a shadow moved in the darkness of the kitchen. I froze, my blood turning to ice. Mom. Dorothy was standing there, a silhouette against the weak moonlight. She held a cup in her hand. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a flat statement. My heart hammered against my ribs, expecting her to scream for my father. "Yes," I whispered, my voice defiant. She took a long sip from her cup. I could smell the cheap whiskey, even from across the room. She was drinking his whiskey. She looked at me, her eyes just as empty as they were at Emily's grave. "He'll find you, you know," she said, her voice slurring slightly. "And when he does, it will be worse. Come with me," I begged, a last, desperate plea for the mother I never had. She laughed. It was the same short, choked, cynical laugh from the funeral. "And go where? Back to nothing?" "No, this is my place." She turned her back to me, facing the window. "Go on then. Run. It doesn't matter. You'll just end up like me anyway. We all do." There was no money, no tears, no hug. There was only the cold, hard truth. I had never had a mother. My mother wanted me to believe that curse. She needed me to believe there was no escape, because if I could escape, it meant that she could have too, and she chose not to. Her words weren't a prophecy, my dears. They were an excuse for the life she had. That realization, more than my father's threats, was what finally gave me the strength. I turned the knob, slipped out into the night, and I did not look back. That final, cold exchange is devastating. Her mother needed Sarah to fail, just to justify her own surrender. But as Sarah steps into that cold night, she isn't just running from her father. She's running toward a life her mother was too afraid to even imagine. With my heart pounding like a drum, I slipped out of the house, the makeshift bundle firm in my hands. The night air was cold, filled with the smell of damp earth and grass. I cut through the neighbors' yards, avoiding the main streets, until I reached the old Presbyterian church in the center of town. As promised, Great-Uncle Walter was there, a solitary figure leaning against the wall. When he saw me, his wrinkled face broke into a smile of relief. "You came," he said simply. "I'm here," I replied, still unsure of what awaited me, but certain that any future would be better than the one I was leaving behind. He led me to an old pickup truck that was waiting further down the road. The engine was already running, the truck idling quietly nearby. He helped me climb in and took the wheel. "Where are we going?" I asked as the truck began to move, crunching softly on the dirt road. "To Lancaster, to my home. It's no palace, but it has plenty of room for a grandniece. And from there? Well, from there you can decide what you want to do with your life. Study, maybe. You don't seem the type born to stay put." The truck moved slowly through the night, leaving my town behind, taking me far away from everything I knew. I should have been scared, but instead, I felt a strange peace. For the first time in many years, perhaps for the first time in my life, I was taking the reins of my own destiny. The journey to Lancaster took almost 2 days. We stopped only to get gas and to eat some of the simple food the great-uncle had packed. During that time, he told me about himself, how he had lived his whole life in Lancaster, how he had been a teacher before retiring, how he had never married but had a house full of books and a small vegetable garden that was his pride. He also told me more about my mother, about what she was like as a girl, cheerful and dreamy, until she married my father. "Your grandfather wasn't much different from your father," he explained. Dorothy left one hell for another, thinking she was escaping. When we finally arrived in Lancaster, I found a town larger and more bustling than my hometown in New Jersey. Great-Uncle Walter's house was on the outskirts, a simple but well-kept building with a flower garden in front and an apple orchard out back, exactly as he had described. "Welcome to your new home, Sarah," he said, helping me down from the truck. "For as long as you want to stay." In the weeks that followed, I adapted to my new life. Great Uncle Walter, besides giving me shelter and food, made a point of introducing me to the principal of the local high school. "The girl is too smart to stay out of school," he argued. And so, at 18, I resumed the studies my father had forced me to abandon. It wasn't easy. I was older than the other students. I had to study twice as hard to catch up. But every book I opened, every new thing I learned, was like a small act of revenge against everything they had tried to deny me. My great-uncle never asked much about what had happened in my parents' house. "The past is like a wound," he'd say. "Sometimes the best way to heal is to leave it alone, not keep poking at it." But he was always willing to listen when I wanted to talk, without judging, without trying to minimize what I had lived through. He was also the one who encouraged me to work part-time at the public library. "You like books, and they need help organizing the collection. Seems like a good match." He was right. At the library, I found not only a job, but a place where I felt useful, respected. The people there, the librarian, Miss Jacobs, the regular patrons, saw me as myself, not as Frank's daughter, not as the sister of the girl who died. Just as Sarah, the dedicated young woman who knew the books like the back of her hand and always had a reading suggestion on the tip of her tongue. It was at the library, too, that I eventually ran into Caleb again. He had moved to Lancaster after his father's death to work at a branch of the store that an uncle owned in town. When he saw me behind the checkout desk, his face lit up with a smile so genuine I felt my cheeks blush. "Sarah, I thought I'd never see you again. One day you just disappeared from town. No one knew where you'd gone." After that, Caleb started frequenting the library almost daily, even though he was a slow reader who took weeks to finish a single book. It wasn't long before everyone in town started talking about the boy from the store who was clearly in love with Professor Walter's niece. Life, which had once seemed like a burden too heavy to carry, gained new colors, new meanings. With great Uncle Walter's support, I managed to finish my studies and even go to college to become a teacher. The dream I had kept since I was a child. I never went back to my hometown. I heard, through acquaintances who traveled between the cities, that my father had died a few years after my escape, a victim of the cirrhosis that his daily whiskey finally caused. My mother, apparently, had moved in with a cousin in Reading, PA, where she lived modestly, doing laundry for other people. I thought many times about looking for her, but something always stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of reopening old wounds, or maybe it was the memory of that last night when she herself told me to go and not look back. I prefer to believe that, in her own way, that was the greatest gesture of love she managed to offer. Great Uncle Walter lived to be 92, sharp and active until almost the very end. His last act of generosity was leaving me his small house in Lancaster, the place that had truly become my home. At his funeral, as I threw a handful of dirt on the casket, I silently thanked the man who had risked everything to save a grand niece he barely knew. "It was a miracle he showed up right when you needed him most," Caleb commented, who by then was already my husband, holding my hand in the cemetery. But I knew it hadn't been a miracle. It had been the most basic human essence, the one that recognizes the suffering of another and decides not to stand still. It was the courage of one man to see in the present the echo of the past and say, "No, not this time. This time will be different." Here I am, so many years later, back in New Jersey. Who would have thought I'd one day return to the region that was the scene of so much pain? But life has its winding paths, and sometimes it takes us back to the beginning, maybe to close circles, maybe to show us how far we've come. I came back here almost 20 years ago, after Caleb passed away. We had built a good life in Lancaster. We raised our 3 children, Megan, Edward, and Walter Jr., yes, in honor of my savior. They were all adults and on their own paths when I was widowed. Caleb passed away peacefully at home, holding my hand. A heart attack that came quickly, without prolonging the suffering. I still miss him every day, especially when the smell of freshly brewed coffee fills the kitchen in the morning. He loved being the first one up, just to make the coffee the way I liked it. After his death, the house in Lancaster seemed too big, too empty. That's when Megan, my oldest daughter, suggested I move closer to her. She had settled back here in New Jersey, where her husband, David, managed the local farmers' co-op. They had a spacious house and were planning to start their family, and she wanted me nearby for when the children arrived. The decision wasn't easy. Coming back here meant facing ghosts I had left behind a long time ago. But it also meant being close to my grandchildren, helping them grow, being a constant presence in their lives, something I never had in my own childhood. So I sold the house. Great-uncle Walter left me and bought this one where I live today. A simple but cozy little house, with a porch where I can watch the sunset and a yard big enough for my herb and flower garden. It's only 3 blocks from Megan's house, close enough to see my grandchildren almost every day, but with enough space to maintain my independence. In the first few months after the move, I confess I walked anxiously through the town streets, always expecting to see a face from the past, someone who might recognize me and bring up stories I preferred to leave buried. But I soon realized that my town had changed as much as I had. The few who might still remember the girl Sarah, daughter of the foreman Frank, were now elderly themselves, barely remembering their own lunch from the day before. Besides, the town itself had grown, modernized. Where before there were only simple houses and dirt roads, now there were new buildings, pavement, new shops. The places that held my worst memories no longer existed. My childhood home had been demolished to make way for a convenience store, and even the old cemetery where Emily was buried had been moved to a more distant, more modern area. It was after a few years here that I discovered my passion for cooking. It started unassumingly, preparing special dishes for my grandchildren Liam and Mia's birthdays. The children loved it, and soon the neighbors started asking if I took orders for parties and family gatherings. What was a hobby turned into a small source of income, and, more importantly, of joy. I specialized in the traditional dishes of the region, the ones I learned watching my grandmother and later perfected with my own touches. My cinnamon apple cider became a kind of local legend, especially during the harsh winters, when people line up at my door on weekends to take a jug home. Today, my days are full of small joys that, added together, make for a full life. I wake up early with the first rooster's crow, more out of habit than necessity. I make my coffee. I sit on the porch to watch the sunrise while I do my knitting, another passion I discovered late. I take care of my garden in the early morning hours, when the sun is still gentle. 3 times a week, I volunteer teaching adult literacy classes at the community center. I never stopped being a teacher, even after I retired. Seeing the light in the eyes of a 60-year-old man or woman when they manage to read their first complete sentence is one of the greatest rewards life can offer. On Wednesdays and Fridays, I have my grandchildren over after school. Liam, now 15, is quiet and studious, like his grandfather Caleb. And Mia, at 12, has my stubbornness and my love of books. I sit with them at the kitchen table. I help them with their homework when I can, and then we prepare some special recipe together, usually desserts, which are their favorites. On Sundays, Megan's house fills up with the whole family. My other children, Edward and Walter Jr., come from Pennsylvania with their families, and we gather for a meal that starts at noon and only ends when the sun is low. On those days, I'm the one in charge of the kitchen, preparing the dishes everyone eagerly awaits. The chicken and dumplings, the pot roast in a Dutch oven, and, of course, my desserts rice pudding for the adults, pumpkin pie for the kids. Sometimes, in the quietest nights, when the only sound is the chirping of crickets in the yard, I let myself think about Emily. I imagine what her life would have been like if she'd had the chance to live it. Would she have married? Had children? Would she have been a loving aunt to mine? I'll never know the answers to those questions, of course. But I like to think that, in some way, she is present in the small joys of my day-to-day life. In Mia's smile, which sometimes reminds me so much of hers, in the delicacy of some of the flowers in my garden, in the way the afternoon light comes through the kitchen window, transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary, exactly how she saw the world. Time hasn't completely erased the pain. I think certain wounds never fully heal, but it taught me to live with it, to transform it into something that, if not beautiful, at least makes sense. Thank you so much for staying with me, my dears. When I look out at my garden now, I always think about one thing. A plant cannot thrive in toxic soil. For the first 18 years of my life, I lived in soil that was watered with fear and cruelty, and I truly believed that I was the problem. I thought I was a bad seed, just like how they spoke about Emily. But my great-uncle Walter, he knew. He knew the problem was the soil, not the seed. He uprooted me from there, and in a new place, with kindness and safety, I was able to grow. If you are listening to me right now, and you feel like you are in toxic soil, I need you to listen to this old lady. You are not broken. You are not a bad seed. You are a human being worthy of sunshine and clean water. Your life is not over. My life is proof that you can be replanted, and you will bloom. And if this story found its way to you when you needed it, it would be a great kindness if you would subscribe to this small channel. When you do, it feels less like I am talking to the wind, and more like I am talking to a friend. It's as if you're knocking on my door to sit on the porch with me. And please, leave a comment with the word grow, so I know you truly stayed until the end. It lets me know I'm not just talking to the wind. Thank you for your time. May you all find your good soil.